We'll do a review of Likutei Sichos in Chelek Yud Zayin, the Sicha for Behar and Beomer. We're going to learn the Sicha Le'ilui Nishmas b'toich Hashiva of Rabbi Chosid Atomim, Rabbi Menachem Mendel ben Meir Yaakov, who unfortunately passed away at the young age of 43, and also we'll learn this for Refuah Shlema for Golda Rechel Bas Sarah Naomi, to have Refuah Shlema Ukreva, and we should only hear Besuris, Toivis, Yeshuas, and Nechamas. We should Zeicha Zayin to the Geula Hamitis Vashlema and the time of Kitzu V'Rananu Shoichnei Ofor, and we should hear only good Besuris, Toivis, Yeshuas, and Nechamas. The Sicha, the Rebbe connects the Beomer, which comes out on Parshas Behar many years, and with the Pirkei Avos that we learn, the fourth Perek, which we learn many times on the Shabbos Parshas Behar, and with the Parshas Behar itself, that we find that in the Parsha, on one hand, it's Behar Sinai, talks about the holy time during Sinai, which is a place where we got the Torah, and yet we talk about nature, and as we read in the Parsha, there's certain descents going down levels. The same thing is in Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, while he says there's a Keser Torah, Keser Urma, Keser Shemtov. Shemtov means the Maisim Tovim is even greater. So there's one hand, he himself, who is Tenosum Nose, emphasizes the Maila advantage of Mitzvahs Maisis. The Rebbe will discuss all this Barichas. Also very interesting, the Rebbe makes note of the number 13, which is the number of the Mishnah in the Pirkei Avos, in which the statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is brought down. Rabbi speaks about the difference between 12 and 13, Ishtalshlus, and Mailam Ishtalshlus, and a lot of more details. So let's start, we'll look at inside. Behar, Beomer. So first the Rebbe is going to establish that this Parsha is read many times during the Pirkei Avos and Parshas Behar and Beomer all come together with the statement of Pirkei Avos of the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who of course is Yom HaElula on Beomer. Aleph, Loitun Minhag, according to the tradition, to learn a Pirkei Avos, to study the chapters of the Avos in the Shabbos between Pesach and Shavuos, in the Shabbos that are between Pesach and Shavuos, and you learn Yedin Shabbos Apedik. On each Shabbos you learn a chapter. So it turns out that many years behind Tikkun Yor, as it is this year as well, the year that the Sicha was written, as well as in our year this year, in Tafshin Pei Beis, when we're learning the Sicha. Shabbos Parshas Behar, learned men dem vierten Perek, that on the Shabbos, the portion of Behar, we studied this fourth chapter. So Bald as Ali Yonim from Minhagi Yisrael. Since whenever we have a Jewish tradition, it's not just a coincidence. We happen to be learning. So while the learning of Pirkei Avos is a tradition, and we happen to do this tradition on Parshas Behar, it just happened. No, all matters from Minhagi Yisrael, which is Torah. And all matters of Torah, a minhag becomes Torah. Zayin and the Diuk are precise. His movement, it's understood as the Perek Revi, that this fourth chapter Otashayches with the Sedre Behar was Malain Dem Shabbos has a connection to the portion of Behar which we read on the Shabbos. Further, Rebbe says, so chapter Revi of Pirkei Avos, in which we have a statement of Shemar Yechois, the Rebbe will say, is many times, most times read on the Parshas Behar. But but there's also sometimes like Beomer in Parshas Behar. Is like Beomer Chal in der Woche from Parshas Behar. Like Beomer comes out in the week of Parshas Behar. Behind Tikkun Yor, as this year, it's in the Bajwa. Und Leuten bewussten Shalom, and as it's known, that was in the year Tovshin Lamed Ches, they say over here. So we know that according to the Shalom, as Yeder Moyed Hot Akishur with the Parsha from the Vok and the Rischal, that every festival or every special time, in this case we're talking about like Beomer, which is the Hilula of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So the Rashalah says that every festival, Hot Akishma, the Parsha from the Vach and the Rischal, has a connection, has a tie to the week in which it comes out. This move on, it's understood as Lag Beomer, Hot Ashaychus to Parsha Behar. Lag Beomer has a connection to the portion of Behar. B'meila Oich zum Ferten Perek in Avos, and therefore also to the fourth Perek of Avos. So Avos is connected to the Parshas Behar because we read it most of the time. Lag Beomer comes in the Parshas Behar sometimes. So that means that Lag Beomer is connected to the Parshas Behar. Lag Beomer is connected to the fourth Perek of the Pirkei Avos. And the Rebbe wants to bring all this out about a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which is connected to Lag Beomer, which is said by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and then the Rebbe is going to connect it to the Parshas Behar. So this whole introduction just to justify this whole connection, that these things are connected because they come at the same time. Gefitman, Takeh, in Heintikel Perek. So we actually find in today's Perek, which is Mishnah Yud Gimel, while the Rebbe points to the notes here in other versions, it's maybe Mishnah Yud Beis, but the Rebbe actually brings down that one of the reasons that the Rebbe brought down the Pirkei Avos and numbered them was because there was certain questions exactly what number Mishnah they are. But this is Mishnah Yud Gimel, and we find over there in Mishnah Yud Gimel a maimer from Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. It says Rabbi Shimon, but Stam Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So this Mishnah is a Mishnah of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So what does it say in this Mishnah? It says over there that Shloisha Ksarim Heim, that there are 3 crowns, which is Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. The Keser Kahuna, there is crown of Kahuna. And also Keser Machas, there is the crown of kingdom. But the Keser Shem Tov Oila Al Gabehem, the crown of a good name, goes beyond, is higher than that. So this is a very clear connection to Lag Beomer, because the statement is said by Reb Shimon was Lag Beomer is the Yom HaHistalkus v'Yom HaHilula. It is the day of the ascent of the passing of, and the day of the Hilula celebration from Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and therefore the statement from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is very appropriate. And Yesh Leimar, so we can say, those was from the Gor Fila Maimorim from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that we have so many, from the very many My Morim of Rav Shimon Yochai, Shimon Yochai, we have him in every single chapter. Any old chapters of the Shisha Sidra Mishnah, he's everywhere. In every perik in the Masechtas of the Shas, Niska Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon is always mentioned. Vafilu b'kelim, even in Maseches Kelim, u'benegoyim v'oktzim, and the Mishnayos of the Goyim and the Oktzim, which is something we find sometimes that it was not studied by all, but by him we say Reb Shimon is everywhere mentioned. Kumt ois as melerent. So why was this Maimer chosen? So kumt ois as melerent od the Maimer von Reb Shimon bar Yochai b'smich zu sein yom Elul. Turns out that we're learning this statement, the saying of Reb Shimon bar Yochai, in proximity to the day of his Elul. When kol ma'asav, during the day of Elul, person's Elul, then all his work becomes elevated, as they bring down from the Tanya that kol ma'asav, the teirosei, v'avidosei, all of the deeds, all of the study, the Torah, all of the teachings, all of the service, asher ovet kol yimei chayav, that the tzaddik, in this case of Shimon bar Yochai, that he worked for all the days of his life. So on the day of his passing, on the Hilula, Shtein and Zeir Shleimus, they get their wholesomeness on a most perfect and great way, Kidua. So why was on this special day of Rav Shimon Yochai, we're saying one statement or one Mishnah from all of the different sayings? Why was this chosen? Is while in the Maimer Hanal, because the above mentioned statement, that expresses the main aspect of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, and that's why it was chosen. Be Hanal, and based on the above, as Lag Beomer is euch verbunden mit Doch von Parshas Behar, that it's also connected because it comes in Parshas Behar. So that same idea that we find by Rav Shimon bar Yochai's expression in the statement in the Mishnah on his Yom HaHilula, which is something very important to Rav Shimon bar Yochai at that particular time when he is at his highest point, is what Rav Shimon bar Yochai gives us out, a very important statement about himself, about what is important to him. His idea is mistaber as the Maimer Rav Shimon bar Yochai Tashach Parshas Behar. So it's logical to say that this statement of Shimon bar Yochai also has a connection to the Parshas Behar. The Rebbe is going to say that in the Parshas Behar we find seemingly a paradox or extremes on two sides, and the same thing in this statement we find two extremes. On one hand, from the holiest place to go down to the lowest place in the parsha, from the level of Torah to go down to the level of practical mitzvahs, even like by some Rav Shimon bar Yochai. Base, let's look inside. In Klolus von unser Sedra gefindt man zwei Tzomos. Generally, in our Sedra, we find two extremes. The Sedra, mit der Mitzvah von Shemitah. What is the content? We start off with the laws of Shemitah, very practical, related to the working of the land. Was ir kiyum is in Eretz Yisrael. So no longer in the Sinai, it's no longer Har Sinai, it's no longer the desert. We're talking already now, we're come down to a certain place. We are fulfilling the mitzvah of Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael. What happens in Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to the Midbar, everything was miraculous. It was the whole journey in the Midbar. But in Eretz Yisrael, where Shemitah takes place, over there, Yidden conduct themselves according to the order from Eretz Nisheves, a settled land, Hanhaga al Pitava. It's a conduct based on nature. And to such an extent, the nature the Pasuk discusses over there, because as Al Pi Torah is done, or so even the Torah brings down the following. That the Yidden wonder if we're not going to sow the land, we're not going to harvest the fields, the fruits, how are we going to survive? So the Torah allows for those questions and addresses those questions and answers those questions. Because Torah gives room. It's such a natural way that you say, if the Shaila man on the question, what are we going to eat? Torah allows that. The Torah says, "Sinisi birchasi." So, and we also don't know how is one going to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah. I mean, the Ibsi gives you a mitzvah. We say, how are we going to do this? So how are we going to do the mitzvah Shemitah? So it means that we're already on a level that we're learning, doing things in nature we don't even know, and we're wondering how we're going to do the Ibsi's mitzvah. And as you go on in the parsha, we talk about this. Rashi explained over there that it's talking about if the person doesn't do this mitzvah, then he eventually is going to deteriorate into lower levels, and eventually it talks about the laws of selling yourself to a non-Jew as a servant and servant to Avodah Zarah, and then also thinking that maybe I don't have to do mitzvahs because I'm a slave to a non-Jew who worships Avodah Zarah. Maybe I should worship Avodah Zarah. So we're talking about a very low level. What's going on? Then the portions come according to the order, as Rashi brings down. One thing leads to the other thing. That in this itself, besides first questioning how we're going to do mitzvahs because of the nature, so then the question then will go the further lower v'chazal zogun, as our sages of blessed memories say, as the parshas b'vayis say that Hayerid Rachmanu litzlan, that these portions represent the show and the order of the descent, God forbid, that how the failure of a Jew can begin. And then it reaches to the extreme descent, as if that you sell yourself to a non-Jew, not only to a non-Jew, but even to serve in the Avodah Zarah nochmal le'eker mishpachas ger. You sell yourself to an eker mishpachas ger, which means was meant hanimker is bring down Rashi hanimker l'Avodah Salilim atzma li's lo shamish chulu. You sell yourself to Avodah Zarah itself to become a servant to serve the Avodah Zarah chulu. And that's such a low descent. That's the way you have descended, deteriorated, and fallen so low. You're such a condition that even Torah, the true Torah, it's not just made up, but the true Torah describes that there is a thought, maybe you should be permitted to violate the Torah, by them, as quoting, as Hoyil V'Rabbi Mekale Arai, just as my master has this promiscuous, the prohibited relationships, and he worships idols. His master, the goy, the goy, so maybe I'm allowed to too. So that's how we're talking about this. Just shows us how low the person goes in the parsha discussion. So that's on one extreme. On the other side, on the other side, is this Alts Nichlal and Atel. This is all included. It's all a part from Parshas Behar Sinai. It's all part of Behar Sinai. Har Sinai is very holy. It's a special place. It's an elevated Har is a mountain, which means it's an elevated land, and it's a distinguished, a gehobener ort place. The ort from Matan Torah, that's the place the Torah was given. That the Yidden were on the ultimate greatness. So all this descent in a Parshas Behar Sinai. When in ganzen Hecher from Welt, over there they were entirely higher than the world. Asach Mervi in Midbar B'chlal was his Hepach from Eretz Nesheves. And this was way more, a lot more than in the Midbar in general, which is not a settled place. Which just the Midbar is not a settled place, but this is in Har Sinai, Matan Torah, and everything. And yet, how do we reconcile the two extremes? The Rebbe says, on the contrary, where do we get, and what is the ultimate goal from Har Sinai is not to remain in the Har Sinai, is to go down into the nature and to battle nature and to still be sustained by that higher level. Is there beard in them? The explanation of this, as he understands, is that is actually in itself that gives us this higher level, gives us the strength for the lower level. The tachlis for Matan Torah and the ultimate goal. The goal of Matan Torah is not as Eden sollen bleiben Behar Sinai. It's not that we remain on the Mount Sinai, und nicht haben Gescheiches zur Welt, and not to have any connection to the world. Und zu Aseder Achaim be'eretz apiteva, and to an order of life as it's in nature. But Adarabe, but on the contrary, the goal is to hereinkommen in Eretz Nesheves, to come into a settled land in Anahoga Apiteva, in a conduct which is, according to nature, the Chergit and Ort, that's it. If you're in a conduct of nature, that allows and gives room for that whole descent that we discussed, Gitarain and Ort, if a ganzen Seder HaYerida, that gives, allows for the entire order of the descent, was very erzählt in Parsha, that is related to the portion of Mitten Koyach from Har Sinai, and with this power from Har Sinai, sollen sie sich disgaber sein von Helm HaTeva, they should strengthen themselves over these obscurity, these blockages of the nature. As trotzdem was der Helm von Teva, that notwithstanding that this obscurity, this blockage of nature, Gitan Ort al Pitoira, allows, the Torah says that this is something which is expected. The Torah gives this room for that. The Baldas Bichlal is Ein Semchin al Hanes. Generally, we don't rely on miracles. So Torah says there gives a room for the shaila, for the question of the shaila. That's a reasonable question. What are we going to eat? Git over Torah. However, so while the Torah allows for the nature to take place, yet allows for these questions, but yet you doesn't remain with the question. There's the answer. The Torah gibt dem Koich zu starken sich, to strengthen yourself, gewaltigen Teva, and to rule over nature. Bis as bitzivisi as birchos lochem bashon hashishis. The Eibishter says, in response to what you're going to eat, that I'll give you my blessing on the 6th year, which is even before the Shemitah starts. Noch eider sekumt shnas hashmitah, even before the year of Shemitah arrives, zeter as er hot tvul shloish hashonim. So you see, you have the grain for 3 years. And also one who sells himself to a non-Jew, to an idol worshiper, which according to the Torah, you are enslaved and you're under the control of your master, in such a manner that there could be such a thought, I should be like him because I'm owned by this Akuman, therefore you should be like him. However, says, Loi, Sasu, Goimer, the Torah says, no, you should not do the way the master does. As oif in yonim from Yiddishkeit, that on matters of Yiddishkeit, hot keiner nit keshlito vayidin. Nobody has any dominance over a Yid. So here we see the two extremes and how the power to overcome the lowest of level, which is the goal, comes from the strength that we get in Har Sinai. And this is similar in the statement in the Pirkei Avos in what Rabbi Chaim Wolosow says. Al derech zeh is euch der Inhalt und Auftrag. Similarly, along this path is the content and the novelty that Rabbi Shimon in Zayin Maimer in his statement. Gimul Kisorim Heim, he says that there are 3 crowns, Hulu, V'keser Shem Tov Oil Al Gabeim, and the crown of the good name is beyond the other crowns. Was Keser Shem Tov meant? What does the crown of the good name? What are we talking about? Dem Shem Tov Asayid Hodur Maisim Tovim. That refers to the good name that Yid attains, a Yid has through good deeds, through mitzvahs. Rav Shimon ben Yochai is doch given. So how do we see the extreme? Shimon ben Yochai is doch given Terosav Nasi. His main occupation, his craft was Torah. So he was level of Torah, and he stresses the extreme of mitzvahs, that's the greatest. So Rav Shimon ben Yochai Terosav Biz as Rav Shimon ben Yochai v'Chaveru, to such an extent was his occupation Torah, that when gebracht in Shasu Poskim, that they are brought in the Shas, the Gemara, and the Talmud, and all the codifiers, they are an example as dudugma of Terosum Nosi. They're an example of people whose crafts was Torah. That means that they were the ultimate example. They were usually brought them. So that was Rav Shimon ben Yochai. So what is he essentially saying? So Rav Shimon ben Yochai says, as nit koken dik of them godly from Torah, notwithstanding the great advantage of Torah, unin Torah gufa keser Torah. We're talking about the crown of Torah, which would be within Torah the highest level of Torah. We're talking about there's a keser and a keser of Torah. Yet, a keser Torah is betachlis hashlemus ba'id. That is, as the Torah can be in its wholesomeness. We're talking not Torah of an ordinary person, but we're talking about the ultimate greatness of Torah, Torosum Nosei, which is a Keser Torah, the craft Torah. He says that Keser Shem Tov, Maisim Tovim, so still that the Keser, the crown of the good name, of the good deeds, Oil Al Gabeim, goes on top of them, is greater than them. While the Tachlis from Torah is, because the ultimate goal of Torah is, as is Obrengen to Maisim Tovim, that should lead to good deed, was to an oif in Welt. Yeah, ultimately the goal is to do good deeds that accomplish in the world, that make a change in the world. That's the ultimate goal. So now we really need to understand this. Why is it, Takya, that the Maisim Tovim, we're not just talking about that you have to do Maisim Tovim. We're talking about that even relative to the level of Torosum Nosei, the Maisim Tovim are the ultimate goal, not by ordinary person, even by someone like Shimon bar Yochai, who Torosum Nosei, Gimel. So, this seemingly requires explanation. okay, most of the world, divas nit teirasum umnosum, those that were not, Torah is not their craft. Ikeroskom is nit in Torah. Their main occupation is not studying Torah. K'maimer Chazal, as the saying of our sages of blessed memory, Harbe osu k'Rabbi Yishmael also biyodom. It says that Rabbi Yishmael, there in the Gemara, there's a machlekes whether a person should just sit and learn Torah. Opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Don't worry about your livelihood. Hashem will provide for you. And Shema Yechoy said no. Rabbi Shmuel says, I'm sorry. Rabbi Yechoy said that. And Rabbi Shmuel says, no, you got to work and you got to both. So the Gemara says over there that many tried to do like Rabbi Yishmael. They worked and they learned and they succeeded. Also, biyodam, they succeeded in, and they did like Rabbi Yechoy just to learn Torah and not worry if they would work. They also biyodam, and they did not succeed. So most people do not have the type of avodah like Rabbi Yechoy to only learn Torah. So for most people, we understand they are not craftspeople, that Torah is their crafts, nor is they geheran some sug for morei uvdin tov. They belong to the category, they're masters of good deeds. They do mitzvahs, they learn and daven and do mitzvahs, but most of the day they're called morei uvdin tov because their occupation is not Torah. They work and for a living. So for those people, if you want to say we're not talking, if it's not Keser Torah, it's just Torah, just for these people, this movement, it's understood. Was by those people, is Keser Shem Tov, Maisim Tovim, the crown of the good name, which is the Maisim Tovim, Agresser Maila, by them it's a greater advantage, Keser Torah, than the crown of Torah, because their level and in their avodah, Maisim Tovim is the Uvdin Tovim is their main thing. Oh, but how could we say this as Rav Shimon Bar Yochai? Shimon was Torah say that his Torah was his craft. Uni is a Talmud. Shimon was a student for Rabbi Akiva. Was halt as Talmud God. He holds Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara has a debate between the Tanoim. What is greater, Torah or the Maisim Tovim? And he says that the Torah is great. The Torah is greater. Talmud is greater. So how could the Rabbi Shimon Yechoy to Rabbi Akiva say so that he should hold as Keser Shem Tov al Gabeim, that the Keser of a good name, the Maisim Tovim, is even higher than the Keser Torah. Hecharech from Keser Torah, and that it's higher also than the crown of Torah. Now, we're not saying, of course, that Rav Shimon Yechoy holds you have to do Maisim Tovim too. We're wondering why is it greater? Hagamas is moving, although it's understood as Oichleit Rav Shimon Bar Yochai that also Kon Rav Shimon Yechoy is Torah Leinid Genug. It's not sufficient just doing Torah, but as Muzen Oich Zay Maisim Tovim, you also need Maisim Tovim. Unochmer with the Lashon Yerushalmi. Further, the language used in the Yerushalmi is about Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Would not Rav Shimon Bar Yochai rhetorically, the Gemara, the Yerushalmi asks, does he not agree that you would interrupt from your study of Torah in order to make a sukkah? In other words, he also agrees that you have to do Maisim Tovim. So that much we know. So we know that you have to do Maisim Tovim. Rav Shimon agrees to that. But we're wondering why is it a greater mile of Maisim Tovim? Maintes l'chayra nor. So this that you have to do Maisim as a start and it fell in Chaz v'Sholem. Maisim Tovim, that God forbid you cannot be lacking in good deeds, mitzvahs. Oich by them was teirosum nosei, even by a person whose crafts is Torah, he must also have Maisim Tovim, cannot be lucky. Azevi by modern Uvdin Tovim is do der Chiyuv zu lernen Torah. Just as on the other hand, person who does good deeds, who's mainly mitzvahs, must also study Torah. There's an obligation to learn Torah. I'll call upon him minimally. Everybody, even those who are not learning, need to at least learn somewhat. I'll call upon him minimally one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. What is the explanation? As by them that even by the one who is at the level that Torah is crafts at that high level, that farmogun maisim tovim, so then the good deeds, the mitzvahs, earn aggressive maila. They have a greater advance with limud Torah as the study of Torah. So we're not talking about that you have to do mitzvahs, and they need to do just like the one who is doing mitzvahs. The modern the tovim has to learn Torah, so the one who learns Torah has to do mitzvahs. But here we're saying Kesher Shem Tov El Agabeim is greater than them. The Rebbe brings down that the possible explanation is that we have to learn, we have to do mitzvahs, not because only there needs to be also mitzvahs, but the ultimate goal of learning Torah is to bring to mitzvahs. So it's a part of the learning of Torah is the mitzvahs. It seemed that we could explain Ados is moving from Yerushalmi Hanau, that we can explain this later on, that is from the above Yerushalmi. Is he not agree, that you make a sukkah, as the Yerushalmi asks, is that Yerushalmi mamshich fragt. Yerushalmi continues and asks weiter, and does he not agree that one who learns on the intent not to do chulu, and as if you just learn on the condition, on the content of not to do, you're better off not to have been born. So what do you see from that? We see from here that the learning has to have the goal of doing. It's not that you also need to do. That's the purpose of the study, is to do. From them is verstandig. So we see from this statement of the Yerushalmi that follows, as the Tambas Medarf Mafsik Zain, last is sukkah, that the reason why one needs to interrupt to make a sukkah is not nor val semus oich zain oich maisim. It's not only because it needs to be also the act of mitzvahs, nor nochmer, but furthermore, ados is der tachlis from limud, that this is the goal of this study, as the lomad is lasis, that you studied in order to do. So the learning needs to be for the purpose of, for the goal of learning is doing. So it's not just you need to do something else, but that's part of the learning. The Baal das Ma'isa mitzvahs is the tachlis from limud, and since the act of mitzvahs is the goal of limud, is the fun gufe gedrunken. So that from this itself we can derive adosat aggressive ma'ila v'chashivas. So it must mean that it has a greater advantage, and more important is the Meisim, because the whole learning is to come to Meisim. So it must be from this we see that actually Meisim is greater, because that's the purpose of learning. But the Rebbe says just the opposite. The Rebbe says that's not really the explanation. The Rebbe says that the bringing to action expresses the advantage of the learning. You learn in order to do. That means that if you do, that the learning is properly, because if you learn not to do, then your learning is lacking. Look, side Rebbe will explain this. So it's still, that idea does not express an advantage of action over learning, because if you don't bring it into action, that means your learning was lacking. And here we say that there is greater, the actions are greater than the learning. Aber, let's look inside. In Emerson is this later. The logic is just the opposite. It doesn't mean that because we have to learn to do, that doing is greater, because that's the ultimate goal, but actually that means that the opposite, that the Torah is greater. It's later. This that one needs to interrupt in order to do a mitzvah is nit mitzad mailas ha-mitzvah. That's not because of the greatness of mitzvahs, nor kidei as a limud ha-Torah zol zayin kideboy. In order for this study of Torah that it should be as it should be, we need it to bring, and we need it to do a ma'aseh so that your study will be as it should be. If you learned and it wasn't to do, is a sachisoren in etzem limud, then it's a lacking in the actual learning. The learning will be lacking if you didn't do. As discussed, spoken about at length, time before, about the language that Alter Rebbe uses in the laws of Talmud Torah, where is mevayer dem din. Over there, he explains the halacha as medarf mafsik zayin for limud Torah. That one needs to interrupt the study of Torah. To do a mitzvah that cannot be done through others. So the Alter Rebbe writes over there in Tilchos Talmud Torah, Kizeh kol ha'adam. For this is all what man is, as the Chachamim said, that tachlis chochma tshuva ma'asim tovim, the goal of the wisdom is to repentance and good deeds. And if he doesn't do so, so what does Alter Rebbe write? This is the diuk. So it turns out that he learned not to do. So that would be a chisoron in his learning, as der mit meint der Alter Rebbe zu masbir sein. Alter Rebbe means to explain over here, ados was medarf mafsik sein dem lernen zu tun the mitzvah, is that you need to interrupt your learning in order to do the mitzvah, is valdos is the tachlis v'shleimus, because the interruption of the mitzvah becomes the goal and the wholesomeness from the chokhmah Torah gufa, that makes the Torah, the chokhmah, wholesome. And the riber, and therefore, if he doesn't do so, so it's not a problem that he didn't do the mitzvah. That's not, but the problem is that his learning was not proper. That he learned not, his learning was not in order to do this haste. Then that is nit mafsik mitten Talmud Torah tzliba mitzvah. If you will not interrupt the middle of your studying Torah for a mitzvah that cannot be done through others, is there chisar in the lacking need, nor in them basarhat need the mitzvah. Not only like, okay, you're missing out, now you don't have the mitzvah, but it's more than that. Not them was the limud is that means that your study was not proper. So then it turns out, as der Maimer Chazal zogt, that this saying of our sages really tells us, as the shleimus from Chochma is Tshuva Ma'asim Tovim, that the wholesomeness of Chochma is Tshuva Ma'asim Tovim. That means when it brings out that when is Chochma b'shleimus, when it brings Tachlis is when it brings out Ma'asim Tovim. But it doesn't say that aber nit as they stay in Hecher from Torah, but not that they are on a higher level than Torah. So now we have our question back to its place. Why does Rav Shimon Bar Yochai say that the crown of the good name goes on top, is on a higher level of mitzvahs than the level of Torah? We all know that statement that we learned, that the ultimate goal of learning is to do mitzvahs, means that the mitzvahs provide the necessary goal of the learning Torah, and otherwise you're lacking in your learning of Torah. But they don't say that the mitzvahs are on a higher level. So the Rebbe is going to explain now that ultimately the goal is, we have two goals basically, and we need, because those are two avodas to refine the world, and the goal of the Torah in the refinement of the world is to show the refinement of the world and how to do the refinement of the world to the mitzvahs, as we'll see in the explanation. Hey, the beer in the explanation, Baal as the kavona from the Bria is to machen die Welt, is to make this world into a dwelling place for him, blessed. Is verstandig, it's understood as alle fanim in the avodas havaya, that the all ways, different means in the service of Hashem in Welt, Zayin and Neutig, they're all important. Today has also in order to accomplish this intent. Nit nor Maisa HaMitzvahs, not only act of mitzvahs, was werden getan mit varim gashmi, which are done with physical matters, but also the study of Torah. Afilu der Eifum for Torah, even the style of the ultimate, the great level of Torah, that Torah becomes the crafts. By welchem is in ganzen ausgetan from Welt. In that case, you are totally undressed of this world. You are not related to the world. You're just studying Torah. That's also is to live machen Welt adirle is baruch. It's ultimately to make this place for a dwelling place for Hashem. Even though you're not dealing with the Welt, with the Gashmias, but you're totally aloof and separate from the world, yet that's part of making the world a Direlei Yisbarach. So how do you make the Direlei Yisbarach? By being separate from the world. One of the explanation in this is a klal. It's a rule that ein chovush matir atzma, that a person who's incarcerated cannot free himself. You need somebody else to come and take you out from the prison. So you cannot take yourself out from the world, really, when you're in world. Is when by Ayidn will given. If Ayid only had nor der Eifen Havoida, only the style of work from Eifton Zaindik in Welt, accomplishing only while you are in the world. They would not be able to refine and to raise the world from its obscurity and its blockage. The river moves sein by Yidden, the Tnua, therefore by Yidden there also needs to be that movement from Oiston sich, to undress and to raise yourself higher than the blockage of the world. You must, in order to get out of the world, you have to be able to get above the world, undo the worldly limitations and go higher in the world. And where do you get the power to raise yourself above the world? Is from divas tarosim, is from those that the Torah becomes their crafts. They need to accomplish this movement from terosim umnosim by alle Yidden, by all Yidden to have that kind of movement, as by Mori Uvdin Tovin, which is the masters of good deeds, most Yidden, is in this manim. How do they accomplish it? So because we said before that in this manim was they darfen al Torah, in the time that they need to, according to the Torah, that they need to devote for the study of Torah. Even let's say it's merely one chapter in the morning and one chapter in the evening. So at that time, at the time they're studying, they're learning Zayin in the Zelbanoif. At that time, their study should be in that same category, same way. The Einer was Hotit Kinandrum, like nobody had any other crafts. The time that they do study should be with such devotion as the same as those who have nothing to do with the world, whose crafts is Torah alone. They have no worries outside of the study of Torah. So how is this done? Both. In order for a Yid whose crafts his Torah, learns Torah all the time, he should be able to tear himself away from his study and devote himself and to accomplish with other Jews. Is nit genug as soll trachten wegen dem. It's not sufficient just to think about it. Nor dann, wenn darf sein schon mit vernehmen mit dem zweiten Yidden. Only then, when he has to actually deal with the other Yid. So then he'll start thinking. By Demut, because at that point, ständig Seder in Atnua von Zayin, reingetan nur in Lernen. Because then, since he's in that mode, from only being put in Torah, is vested fully in Torah, Ken Zayin, it's possible, as ever Demut, it can appeal Zayin Bazich, then he won't be able to impact himself, to interrupt his study, and then go ahead to deal with such, which is on a lower level than a situation that Torah is described. He may not be able to do that if he will never, while he's connected to Torah, not have something that he's able to think about the other person. Und der Riber, and therefore, the limud Torah gufa. So that's why this Torah study itself, Zayin durchgenommen mit der Kavana. So it needs to be taken through, absorbed, with the intent, his learning of Torah, as the tachlis from them limud, that the goal of the study is kidei Welt to do into the world. Also by other people. The Tnuf the Rosum Nosi. You should have other people also have that same Tnuf when they're learning, that same devotion, nothing, no worries. So you have to, in your Torah, have to think about somebody else, how your Torah to influence, how you're going to pass on that level of Torah Nosi to others who are Morud and Tov. This is similar to what's explained about the unique greatness of Rabbi Akiva. So when the four sages entered the Pardes and everybody was sort of negatively impacted, with the exception of Rabbi Akiva. So it says because Nichnas b'Sholem and Yotze b'Sholem. He came in with peace, so he exited with peace. Nicht wie die andere was Nichnas und Pardes Yotze b'Sholem, unlike the others who entered into the Pardes and they did not go out in peace. So it's explained what allowed for Rabbi Akiva to come out in peace is because he went in lechatchila in peace. Ados was said is Yotze b'Sholem is given the far. This that he came out in peace was because was nichnas b'Sholem, that he entered properly b'Sholem. Sein Knisse in Pardes, his entrance into the Pardes, sein Rotzi, which means going into the pardes, the secrets of Torah, going to the orchard. That was in a way that his yearning, his running, gained from Welt, which is the idea of to leave the world. That's the idea of going into the pardes. In pardes is given b'sholem. He was going with peace. With their kavona, he had the intention as from them, rotzoi, that from this running, so the noch zayin der shuv in Welt, that there should be later on the return inward. Und der river v'yotze b'sholem, that helped the yotze b'sholem. So the Teirosum Umnosum, in order to them to be able to accomplish with the modern Uvdin Tovin, the level of Teirosum Nosei and their time that they're learning should be in that style, in that devotion, that they need to, while they're learning Torah, they have to have, and that's the Nichnas B'Sholem, similar to the story of Rabbi Akiva, in order to be able to do that, because otherwise they don't have that intent in their learning. They may not be able to go ahead and share that level with the others. Based on this, we can explain the above mentioned Yerushalmi. In Limud HaTorah, as far as interrupting the person's study of Torah, even if it's a style of study of Torah, to leave a siyas mitzvah of doing a mitzvah. Does he not agree that you interrupt? The Rishalmi is Meisiv Nochan Inya. Then he adds another thing. The less Leila Reb Shimon bar Yochai halamed amnas lasis chulu. Does Reb Shimon bar Yochai not hold that one who learns to do yes loymar as the main the Rishalmi zu sagen? What is the Rishalmi intent to say? Not only did he in actuality interrupt for building a sukkah, and not only that the ultimate goal of the learning is venes kumtarop in lasis, that when it does come down in doing Republican al-Siv Dalid, but even more than that. The lamed gufa is given amanas lasis. Learning was for doing. Showing in etzem limud, in the learning itself, you need a sense as the kabono and the tachlis halimud is lasis, that the intent of the learning is in order to do. Well, anders, because if you don't have it, lamed amanas lasis, it's better if Shazainu Meglech zu Mafsik Zain later, there might be impossible to interrupt later on.